Hello, my name is David Rogerson. I'm a product director at Foolproof, and I lead our product practice and our early stage innovation proposition. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago as part of a Foolproof products event, and the theme of the event was placing better bets in the context of product and product organizations. So I'd like to share that with you. It's a brief talk. We'll touch on a couple of different ideas, but it'd be great to get your feedback at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quiz. Does anyone know what the word of the year was in 2022, according to Collins Dictionary? Okay, it's quite hard to get actual feedback when you're in a room on your own, but I'm imagining you're shouting things like gaslighting or Omicron or goblin mode. And if you were, you'd all be wrong, because the word of the year in 2022 was permacrisis. Okay, so what's a permacrisis? A permacrisis is an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. I can't imagine why that was the word of the year in 2022. Honestly, I think it feels like we've been in a permacrisis since David Bowie died in January 2016. And since then, everything seems to be sliding downhill quickly. But I came across this word on a insurance broker's website. And it was an advert for a podcast, I think. But it hit me in the face. So the banner said, risk and opportunity in the world's permacrisis. How do we navigate a world in a state of constant crisis? And I thought, that's a really good question. How do you start navigating a world in a state of constant crisis? And I started reflecting on it, not just in terms of my, humanity at large, but how does it affect me in the job that I do as a product director and as a consultant to organizations trying to handle this kind of change? And it's no surprise, really, that insurance industry is feeling this, right? Because it's perhaps no more obvious as to what that industry is currently facing. How do you make good decisions when all the historic data that you have is no longer really predictive of the future? So in insurance, right, you would have 1 in 100-year events, maybe a flood or a wildfire. But those things are starting to happen every year or every couple of years. So how do you place bets against that? So that's prompted me to reframe this talk, really, and think about how do we place better bets in a permacrisis. I only have about 15 minutes to explain that, and I've got 3 points to hit. So we'll see how we get on. So how do you place better bets in a permacrisis? Well, firstly, learning to manage complexity. So a trait of the permacrisis is complexity, and complexity theory argues that some systems show behaviours that can't be fully understood just by looking at their individual parts. And out of these systems comes unexpected and strange or weird behaviours. So essentially, complexity really is around, you could perhaps simplify it into being a whole bunch of unknowns bouncing off one another, and out of those unknowns bouncing off one another, things that we didn't expect pop out, and the things that you can't foresee ahead of time because there's no data to predict it, and it really is often the consequences of the system itself. Because of this emergent behaviour, like I said, there are lots of unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, for those of you who are old enough to know who he is. You could argue maybe him and his ilk were part of the reason we're in a permacrisis. So we've got kind of complex systems acting in strange ways, but we also have complex systems interacting with other complex systems, adding to more fun and games. There are also different types of complexity. One aspect is the difference between soft and hard complexity. So soft complexity is more around kind of emotional traits, and it's in the realm of humans. And then we have hard complexity, often in the realm of logic and machines. And then we have areas where these two things kind of cross over. And a good example of that would be the creation of a complex digital product or digital transformation within an enterprise kind of context. I have a theory that lots of digital transformations go wrong because they're treated as hard complexity, like it's about changing this for that, as if there are no other components. And they don't take into account the emotional involvement that technology has in the actual lives of actual people, and whether that's the end user that it's supposed to be designed for or the way the teams are organised to deliver it. It's no surprise, really, when you go into organisations that are stalling in their digital transformation, the amount of kind of stress and unhappiness and I imagine burnout that's occurring because these kind of architectural changes that are happening from a technology perspective have real impacts on the teams that are there to deliver it. So another aspect of complexity is we get into trouble when we try to solve it by oversimplifying. An example from a recent project. So they've created, this client has created lots of individual implementations for clients of their service. So you imagine each client comes to them and says, we want this thing, and they say, yes, of course, we'll build that thing to you. The consequence of that is over, the last 10, 15 years, that's created lots of variation within the things that are out there. You couldn't really call it a product. You could just call it kind of lots of customized implementations. And they've got kind of 90 odd different platforms supporting these different solutions across the globe. Now, from an engineer's perspective, this seems really simple, right? Their answer was, let's get all these things into one platform and standardize everything, and we're going to save lots of money. Which kind of makes sense, right? It's not crazy, except it's not that simple. In fact, it's complex. Their existing solutions are already being used. So unless you're accounting for the churn that will inevitably occur when you tell some of those clients that the thing that they currently have that works will be replaced by a thing that is less than the thing that they've already got, there is going to be people walking out that door. You've just got to factor that in. Some of them will be happy. They're probably unhappy with the existing solution and they like their welcoming of this new approach, and others will leave. So unless you've factored that into your kind of cost analysis, then you're already probably in trouble, right? Unless the demand for what gets built is managed by a healthy product team, you will have no idea where to start this transformation, or even if you need to start it at all. So unless your teams align with the architecture or vice versa, you'll find yourself replicating the 90 different platforms that you're trying to replace in your own platform. You might call them as one thing, they might all sit in one place, but there's 90 different versions of those things, probably worked on by a good number of teams, probably not operating collectively. So you need to understand flow, you need to understand relationships, you need to understand where value sits. It's not enough just to think of it as a technology, move this from here to here. There are different tools and frameworks that we can use that help us navigate this kind of complexity. One of them is the Cynefin framework, which provides a tool for knowing which domain you're operating in at any time so that you can choose the right approach in order to navigate it. Getting it wrong can be disastrous. Okay, if you start treating a complex problem as a simple problem, what will probably happen is you will lose control of the situation and it will slip into this chaotic domain. In fact, most of the time, most of us are in this disorder state. And that really is a reflection on us not really thinking about or knowing where we are at all in that, or not having any play particularly, or just kind of patching stuff together, and responding. Again, you face the same risks of slipping into this chaotic domain. What the Cynefin framework suggests is that when you're in this complex domain, the only real way of making your way through it is kind of probing, learning, moving, probing, learning, moving. So, familiar with us if we understand agile, really. That part of that is this ability to kind of move, small bit at a time, learn, move, etc. So with complexity, we need to observe and map and understand and probe and experiment and learn. And we should also understand that strategy is emergent. If you would try and apply a 5-year, very detailed, micromanaged plan around a really complex space, you will find yourself rudely wrong quite quickly, I imagine, as your best laid plans don't survive the weirdness that is a kind of complex space. So navigating through this space is sort of like holding a lamp in the dark or a torch in the dark and kind of shining your light in front of you to make your way through this space where you're not sure what's in front of you at any one time. It also requires a different kind of thinking, and that thinking is systems thinking. And I mean that in opposition to a reductionist one. Now, in the West, we have hundreds of years of a scientific approach which values reductionism, the ability to kind of boil things down to their individual pieces, which is fine in certain contexts. But when it comes to solving problems in complex spaces, you need to be able to understand the relationships between things, not just the essence of the thing itself. It's the relationships that create these emergent properties. And as I say, you can't solve these problems by isolating individual parts. Okay, so how do we solve better bets in a permacrisis? Number 2, design for adaptability. So we often hear, as we enter into a new client relationship, some familiar stories. So leadership's looking for more governance, tighter rules, more reporting. This is often a reaction to management becoming frustrated with a lack of insight into what teams are doing or producing, and there's this kind of lack of trust. From their perspective, the leadership has been very clear with what they want. They've given it to the team, and what's coming out the other end is not delivering on what they imagined should be delivered. And then from the team's perspective, they're lacking direction. And in fact, what they're really doing is waiting at the other end of a pipe to see what gets kind of sent down to them or chucked over the fence by the business. And for those you can't see me, I'm doing air quotes there around the business. As if they're not all the business, right? They're all in the business. But there's this, you notice this split as soon as you walk into organizations, and they start referring to them as these kind of two kind of diametrically opposed parts of an organization. So this dynamic creates really slow, demoralized, inefficient teams. And crucially, key decision making is placed in the hands of people further away from the problem and solution space. There should be no one closer to the problem than your product teams. Okay, so if you've split those things up, you are already putting them in a position where it's very difficult to succeed. It also makes it incredibly hard to adapt to change because they can't see it coming. So essentially, come back to that analogy, they're walking in the dark and you're telling them which way to go. If anyone's familiar with 1980s children's TV, there was a show called Nightmare, where one of the kids would have a helmet on where they couldn't see where they were going, and in a terrible, well, I suppose good at the time, but in a strange VR world, other children would have to tell them to move forward, left, right, And if they got it wrong, they would fall into an abyss and it would be the end of the game. And in a sense, that's how often these teams are operating, in this kind of helmet on, waiting for someone to tell them whether to stop left or right. But as is often the case in large organisations, blaming them when it all goes wrong. So we have to create kind of adaptive organisms that can eat through this complexity. And I use that analogy because actually thinking in terms of almost like biological systems is a much healthier way of thinking about the space that you're in. Don't think about building buildings or building stuff, right? Think of cells, think of gardens, think of kind of ecosystems. That's the mindset that you should be having as you think about complex spaces. And we need operating models that design for autonomy, that design for learning and self-sufficiency and problem solving, so that they can overcome any unknowns that it faces. Okay, so how do people know why they're doing something? In other words, how do you know how to achieve what you need to achieve when things get messed up, as they inevitably will? Right? You need some kind of shared value framework that allows anyone in the organisation to answer why and act accordingly as new information emerges. So a developer working on a button should understand how working on that at any time directly contributes to the goals and ambitions of the business. They should understand the impact it will make, however seemingly small. They should be able to walk the ladder from that button up to the solution, up to the ideas, up to the opportunity it's feeding into, which contributes to them meeting this target outcome, which contributes to this major challenge that's part of their product vision, which contributes to business impact and ultimately to the corporate vision. If you can't do that, or certainly if you can't do it over most of what you're doing, then there's a disconnect between your strategy and the work on the ground. It's a great, I don't know what you'd call him, product guru called John Cutler, who worked for Amplitude previously and wrote the book on North Star metrics and continues to write really smart stuff about how to develop products. And he has this quote: "So I encourage teams to think about their roadmap as a portfolio of bets. Different initiatives have different risk-reward profiles. When the strategies and goal changes, the mix changes." And the bets that we make are at different levels as well. So bigger bets such as the product vision and what markets we play in, down to smaller bets around particular ways we might execute a solution. And we should also think about how we spread these bets. If we only consider low-hanging fruit, for example, perhaps because we've measured on output rather than impact, we'll miss these opportunities to create real defensible value, the stuff that kind of help us win in the market. And you see this in teams, right? We've got to keep busy, so we're going to pick this low-hanging fruit. We've got to pick this rather than sometimes doing the work to think about what might be the best thing we can deliver that gives us competitive advantage, rather than what's the easiest thing to get out at any one time. You're also making trade-offs across a number of different dimensions. It's not just effort versus impact. You're also dealing in probabilities, not absolutes. So we have to get used to making the best choice in the moment based on the information we have to hand, and confident that we've taken reasonable steps to mitigate the risk and increase our confidence. We need to be thinking in spectrums and probabilities, not in absolutes. Okay, finally, around how do we place better bets in a permacrisis? Increasing the frequency of your learning loops. So this is a quote from Craig Strong, who's a practice lead at AWS, and he lands this point. So the dominant companies of tomorrow will be those companies that develop the capability to learn the fastest and are able to realize the potential of the knowledge within the data available. Okay, so the companies that develop the capability to learn the fastest and who are able to realize the potential of the knowledge within the data available. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be learning the fastest? It reminded me of this model. So in the 50s, a military strategist called John Boyd created the decision-making framework called the OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. Okay, so in the observe phase, you're really gathering information from your environment. So you can imagine this in a military environment, but you can imagine this in a business environment as well, right? We're observing what's going on in our market, what's going on in our business even. We're then orientating ourselves. So we're processing the information that we've gathered, and we're weighing up the factors like the risks and the opportunities and the priorities. And the goal really is to form a comprehensive understanding of the situation. So we've seen it, we're understanding it, and now we move on to deciding. So based on that orientation, we're making decisions about what course of action to take next. And then, of course, we're executing this decision. We're acting. And once we've done that, we're moving back into the observe phase in order to understand and assess the outcomes from that action and adjusting our next actions accordingly. So the premise from John Boyd is that if you execute this learning cycle faster than your opponent, you will gain an advantage. You'll essentially get inside their ability to learn. So a real life example of this was in the battle for World War II. So I think I stole this from a podcast called Hardcore Histories. I can't verify that because it was a long time ago, but it's somehow lodged in my head. So the French had, on paper, a superior tank capability. However, 80% of those tanks didn't have radios. And when their initial plan failed, so the German tanks kind of didn't match the military doctrine that kind of France had imagined would be adequate, they couldn't adapt in the field because essentially this loop stalled at the first kind of turn. There was poor data because of the lack of live communication, and they were completely outmaneuvered by a more mobile German force. So in short, more data in, more quickly, with quicker decision cycles, will greatly increase your chances of success, or at least most of the time. If we look forward, are there any ways that we could use technology to execute that OODA loop quicker? And it feels like the answer would be yes. We're currently working with a partner in the digital twin and scenario modelling space. And I think it represents what I believe will be the future of placing better bets. And the premise is to use all the data available in the business to build a live virtual representation of the business. I call this a digital twin. You may be more familiar with digital twins in the concepts of cities. So there are lots of cities who have started to create a kind of a digital layer that sits over their city, which represents, so things like the train timetable or the bus timetable, or a crime in certain areas. You can start associating data with locations. You can also do that in a business. You can think about how data flows through an organization, say the time it takes to move products from here to here, how many things are stored in a location at any one time, how many people are involved in making decision making, what impact does that have on timings, for example. Once they have that digital twin, they then let AI simulate billions of scenarios using a technique called reinforcement learning. So they essentially are playing the game, or giving it an objective, playing the game again and again and again. And it is failing in that game again and again and again until it starts to win. And then it will do it again and again and again until you essentially, in the safety of this kind of virtual model, it can start to suggest what the best strategies for success might be. Okay, and then balancing up all these kind of relevant dimensions across the entire system, something that's very difficult for humans to do on their own, or at least it takes a long time. But you can imagine this happening literally in almost real time. So it's essentially a hyperspeed OODA loop. And I believe that this combination of AI and human decision making will be the key to managing complexity in what I believe will be an ongoing permacrisis. So to recap, how do we place better bets in a permacrisis? 1, manage complexity. Systems could have unpredictable behaviours that can't be understood by analysing individual parts. There are different types of complexity, such as soft and hard. There are frameworks like the Cynefin framework that help identify the domain of your domain that you're working in and help you find the right approach to navigating it. And it requires a different mindset, moving towards systems thinking over reductionism. We need to be designing for adaptability, because autonomy fosters adaptability and fast problem solving. But we need, within an organisation, a shared value framework so we know that everyone understands how their work contributes to the organisation's goals. And then finally, we need to increase the learning loops. So we learnt about OODA loop and how a faster cycle can give us an advantage, and how maybe technology such as AI can be used to offer hyper-speed decision-making in complex environments in the future. Okay, hope you've enjoyed that, and thank you.